Hey, I want to welcome our viewers, Kennesaw Happening Podcast. I'm Golfer Pete, and in the studio, we have a gentleman that um, reflects a lot of my background, which is restaurants. There 12 years I spent in that industry. So I twisted Mike's arm to come to the studio here at Overture and talk a little bit about what he does. So, Mike, introduce yourself, who you are, what you do, and who you serve, and then we'll get into the podcast.
Sure. I'm Michael Ware. I am recruiter, a headhunter for food service sales and marketing manufacturers, be they food, beverage, or non-food. I recruit sales and marketing people for them and been doing it for almost 34 years now. Got into it totally by mistake and love every minute of it.
Well, I will say, because I'm going to ask you why you got into it. We'll
Sure.
get to that. But the restaurant industry, there is nothing slow about that. It's a fast-paced, highly stimulating industry. But tell our viewers what got you into recruiting.
Sure. Well, I graduated from the University of Georgia in 1983. Went to work for Kane for a couple of years, selling copiers and faxes in 1983 that did not work. Basically, none of them did. Mm-hmm. I just knew that wasn't my route. So I took a job with a small junior college, basically. And as it grew, I grew with it, became a director of their school down in South Florida, about 400 students. Realized that's probably not what I wanted to do. I was in Missouri, moved to Florida, opened up a sign company, went back to Missouri, opened up a sign company with a friend of mine, wife actually. Bad partnership, good friendship, but bad partnership. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to come closer to home, which was Savannah. And I started looking for a job, and I went to a bunch of recruiting firms, and they were like, well, what in the world are we going to do with a guy who ran a junior college and had a sign company? How about coming to work for us? And I've got a finance degree, so I was going to be a finance recruiter. And the day before I was to start, the company I wanted to work for, Lucas Group, still very good friends of mine. Mm-hmm. They were bought by Korn Ferry a number of years ago. Called me and said, what would you think about doing food service recruiting? And my first question was, what's food service? And they said, well, you think it'd be a better situation for you. It's a relationship-oriented business. Mm-hmm. And the reason they were calling me was they were going to fire the girl that day. Mm-hmm. They probably still would have fired her, but if I said yes. And so I got into it totally by mistake, and did that for 32 of the 34 years, ran the accounting finance division for the company for a couple of years in the interim. And then when I, about 2 years into running it, after being with the company for about 13, the guys drove the planes into the buildings, and accounting finance dissolved. Mm-hmm. Basically, nobody was hiring them. My largest client was Delta. And went back into food service, went on my own, and 4 months after the 9/11 thing, and scared to death, but love working on my own, and I operate a one-man shop, and I am very much a one-man shop.
That's always good. You know, when you're working for somebody else, you know, you have a paycheck. When you're on your own, you obviously have to create value for your clients. So what would you tell our viewers about how do you create value for your clients?
Sure. Well, part of it is just doing it long enough, outlasting people to a certain extent, and then learning the business. I have never sold a bit of food nor beverage nor a cup in my life. Mm-hmm. But I got to know the industry very well and ended up with some very good clients. Originally, my largest clients were the large CPG companies, Campbell's Soup Company, Frito-Lay Food Service and Venn, when they were a completely separate entity from PepsiCo. They're owned by PepsiCo, but a separate mm-hmm. entity. And then over the years, it tends to be large clients, but more very large private companies, or not what you consider the largest CPGs, the Chemist Food Services, the Basic American Foods, people like that. And basically, I think people just trust me. They know I'm going to work hard, and mm-hmm. I'm not going to try to push them on a candidate that's not superb.
Right.
when I can, I try to work with A+ level companies, and they want A+ level candidates.
Right.
And there are times when I do things where I know that what the hiring constrictions are for some of the companies where it might be a little different, but knowing what their needs are, and it's just really diligence more than anything else. And never once lie about anything.
Yep. Yeah. So the truth is always the best policy. What would you say to our viewers, like when you mention relationships and A+ clients? What have you seen anything change in the last few years about what type of people you're looking for, or has it been consistent?
No, very different. When I started this out, if a company gave me a position to work on, I would find 12 people. Now, my goal was to find 12 people that fit it, that were able to do the job, that were interested. I'd pare it down to 6, they'd pare it down to 3, and they'd hire one. Now, if I can find 2 great candidates for a job for great companies that are, I don't want to use the word great too much, but exceeding great candidates, then I'm doing a good job. Part of it too is that for so many companies, and I know it's the demographics of birth rate and the like, but when I started this out, there are probably 35 really good training companies in food service manufacturing. I'd say there are 5 now.
Wow.
And they're not hiring kids.
I'm
a 63-year-old man. Most of the candidates that I talk to are a lot closer to my age than they are to people who have long runways in their careers, and that's become very difficult. And it's an industry problem. There aren't as many kids, for lack of a better term, and they've got so many opportunities.
What do you think? I mean, that to go from that number down to a couple training companies, because training's everything. You got the minor leagues with baseball, and you have leagues that feed up to the higher levels. So is it like, why do you think, in your opinion or in your experience, has it shrunk down to just a few?
Partially because the other pieces to food service beyond manufacturing have collapsed a little bit, and I don't mean that in a negative fashion. It's just there were 20 distributors in this area that I could name. Now, I'd be hard pressed to name 5 distributing companies, the BFGs and the Cisco's of the world. Same thing with brokers. There were brokers that would handle a quarter of Georgia. They regionalized and then nationalized, needed less people. Those were good entrees into the manufacturing realm. And then there were the direct companies that hired kids right out of college. Kellogg's, for instance, would probably hire 8, 10 food service kids every year. Some of them would go away. Some of them would end up being VPs of sales for Kellogg. Some of them would go to other companies. But when you take that from 25 of those type of companies to 5, that becomes hugely problematic. And I have no idea what the answer is, other than to make clients understand that's the reality of things. We want somebody who's going to be a 20-year person with us. Well, that's the other thing too. That doesn't happen. But when I started this, if I had somebody who had less than 5 years in a company, I might pass them over. In terms of calling them. Now, a year and a half, 2 years with a company, I will consider it, and the company has realized that's just the case. The other piece to it too is that companies have realized that they do not have the luxury of age discrimination. It's going to be who can do the job today.
If you had to kind of look at a couple years, and then I think a lot of industries are being challenged with the talent pool. What I know you don't have an exact answer, but what would you suggest if you had the magic wand and you could bring more talent to food service? What would you tell your manufacturers or educate people about the need? Because if you don't have talent, I mean, there's a big void.
Sure. I don't know that I've got an answer to that. It's attract younger people into the industry, pay them exceedingly well. That's another thing that people have to look at. It's like, well, we've always paid at this level for this type of job. I've got 25 and 23-year-old daughters, and I look at what they make. I was 50 before I made that type of money. And yeah, that's just the reality. You can say, well, this is what we've always done, but and also make it attractive. There was something too that I haven't seen in a while, and I haven't really paid that much attention to it because I tend to go at least upper middle level individuals. But there was a lot of industry training through IFMA, and not just for the most senior people, and not just for means of getting people together at the most senior levels. It was to train a 22-year-old kid about everything about food service. A 2-year Nestle person in 1990 would know about as much as a lot of people I deal with now with 20 years experience in companies that don't have much training in terms of knowing the width and breadth of food service.
Well, that's interesting because you're right about the idea that, hey, I've always done it this way. We had a general manager of Pine Tree, Brad Nycom, on, and he was talking about just sous chefs and line cooks that he was paying, let's just say 12, and then COVID hit. Now he's paying 20. And so all of a sudden you get 40% increase in your labor costs like that. I mean, it happened overnight. So if he were to say, well, I'm not paying any more than 12, he wouldn't have anybody on the line, because I think you're right about that. Everybody's got to readjust to attract the talent. That's good advice to really help companies say, what we're doing today is not what we did 10 years ago, 5 years ago. And you're right. Now I'll go to, I like that you spent some time in Savannah. I know one of your daughters has a name, Savannah. So how many years did you spend in Savannah, and what could you tell our viewers about Savannah? I like the river walk there, but.
Well, yeah, I do have a daughter named Savannah. I have a daughter named Peyton, 25 and 26. My daughter, Savannah, works for a U.S. congressperson out of Alaska. She and I have exactly the opposite political views, but I'm extremely proud of her. My other daughter is almost finished Bachelor of Fine Arts at UGA, and hopefully soon. But I grew up in Savannah. It was idyllic. I lucked out. I grew up with Ozzie and Harriet of the Low Country. My parents are luckily still at 89 and 85 are still with me, and love them to death. It was kind of, people talk about bad childhoods, and I realize they have them. And I had friends of mine who were around me often at my house because they did not have that. But I never thought I'd leave. I thought I'd go to Athens for 4 years and come back, and ended up in St. Louis. And I thought that was the biggest place I'd ever seen at the time. Had 3 million people in it when Atlanta had 1.2 million people. And fell in love with St. Louis. And I moved to Atlanta and fell in love with Atlanta. So I found out that it didn't really matter where I lived. It was the people. I still have remarkable friends in Savannah. I guess that's the personal story anyway.
Yeah. What would you say? I mean, I always, people, it's funny that you hear a lot of people that have spent time in Savannah or lived in Savannah. They really enjoy that port, the coastal town and the history behind it and all that. Now let's jump into the Atlanta area. So when you're not working, what do you like to do for fun?
Good. You play golf with me a few times. I play a lot of golf every single round I play. I
like that.
I'm not a horrible athlete, but my athleticism was based on being very large at 17 years old. Being able to knock people over, that doesn't work in golf.
Yeah.
I'm a reader, and I don't mean that in a educating myself type sense. But I'm interested in a lot of different things. So I can go in a bookstore and just pull a book down and read it. We were talking about podcasts as we're on one now. I love digging deeply into different topics. And that certainly is helped me on my job too. It's I don't believe there's 7 degrees of separation between people.
Yeah.
I think there's probably any vice president of sales, any president of food service, and VP of marketing or territory manager I speak to, I can usually, within about 2 degrees of separation, maybe 3, find something that's similar between us. And so I don't have hobbies. I'll do whatever other people are doing.
Well, you're a people person. I mean, so that's a talent. But I wanted we were talking before we came on about the podcast. The average person in America watches 4 hours of TV. What would you tell that average person that watches that much TV? What would be the benefits of really shifting to something like podcasting? What have you gained personally by, diving into podcasting more than most? I mean, I do the same thing. You say hours every day. What would you say to our people that are just TV watchers that maybe, are they missing anything in podcasting, and could you encourage them?
Oh yeah. Podcasting has become my entertainment and learning vehicle. It's I got rid of cable a couple of years ago. Partially because it's expensive, partially because I just found myself plopping down in front of something, saying, I watched this for 10 minutes, realized 2 hours later, I was watching something I didn't even care about. And yeah, everything changes. Our parents sat down and watched sitcoms,
right,
from 7 p.m. to 11 p.m. That kind of went away a bit, but there's diving into subjects. I often find myself changing my opinions of things because, or at very least understanding why somebody has a different opinion than me. Because if you're just watching a 90-second clip on be it a Fox or an MSNBC, whichever side you happen to be on, yeah, you're getting an opinion. You're getting just one little bolt versus why is somebody thinking this way, and it's valuable. Plus, it's just a unique learning tool. You can read, but it takes you a certain amount of time to read.
Right.
The major points of a book might be on page 30, 100, and 200. And a podcast, just like you're doing now, you can focus it up against something, up against whatever becomes most important.
Yeah, I listened to, there's a gentleman named Uberman, and he's very good. And he got into podcasting a couple years ago, and he's he works out of Stanford, and he has a lab, and he does a lot of high end in the health field. But they asked him, Peter Attias, I said, well, what do you see yourself doing in a couple of years? And he didn't hesitate 1 second. He said podcast. And so then he asked the follow-up question, why? And he said, I used to publish papers in my industry. Well, he still does. But he said, when you publish a paper and then somebody has, like you said, another viewpoint, that paper, I mean, it takes a lot for those to overlap. But he said, I can interview 2 people back-to-back days with opposing views, and I immediately can dive in to those opposing views, because I do think you're right. It's important to get that information for you to decide based on somebody's viewpoint or somebody's ability to share information. And podcast is so quick to do that versus the traditional way, which is kind of like network, the 3 stations that we used to listen to all the time, ABC, CBS, and NBC, and then Fox came along. So I think as we change, information is coming to us in different form. So what would you say to our viewers out there? What are some of the podcasts you've enjoyed out there in the marketplace?
Well, depending on who he has on, Joe Rogan. And one of the things I heard from Rogan early on, it was actually one of his comedy stand-up things. He said, people said, I know. He said, what are you, 30? What, how do you know? He said, I don't know anything. He said, but I listen to people who know.
Mm-hmm.
The depth of it, I enjoy people who sometimes have my views, sometimes don't, but are willing to listen to people without cutting them off. I mentioned Megan Kelly, Uberman, Peter Attia, when I maybe have eaten poorly the day prior.
Yeah.
That's something that will write me, but it's a way of me thinking of something that, okay, this interests me. And versus going into a Barnes and Noble and seeing 60,000 books or whatever they've got in there. I can look at these podcasts. There are people that Scott Adams would be one. I don't always agree with him, and his presentation might even be a little boring to me. But the information that I get from it is great, and things that I really don't know. I'm hoping that as long as my mind works through my old age, that the last thing I do before my mind goes is learn something new.
Right. No, that's a good philosophy. And I always, as we're winding down, why don't you tell our viewers, because I know you're busy and our viewers love how you highlighted so many good points. How can they get a hold of you, especially if they're a company out there that needs your knowledge to be able to find the talent that they need to run their company? How can they get a hold of you?
Sure. Well, for one thing, I look at Pete's setup here. He's pretty technical oriented, and a lot of things he's done in the past, I am not. I can barely use Word. And so I don't even have a website, for instance. I squat on it. A part of that is I have a very pointed thing of when I'm looking for people. I am not looking to broadcast myself. I always tell people, if I've got 3 hiring managers, could be 3 people in the same company, one of them's angry at me. Just don't have enough time to get it done. So it's a limited number of clients, but it's also a very limited number of candidates too. They've got to fit, and they've got to be very, very good. So somebody's going to pay me X percentage of someone's salary. They need somebody exceedingly good. But in terms of getting in touch with me, it's simply mware at foodservicerecruiting.com.
Okay.
Or my telephone number is 770-433-1189. Again, 770-433-1189. I'm a sole proprietor, so if it's either my voicemail or me picking up the phone, and I would love to talk to anybody who ever wants to speak to me, whether they're a client, a candidate, or just somebody who's curious. I always call people back, no matter what. Might not be the same day, but I lucked out. I found something. I love what I do.
Right.
During COVID, I've done very well in this business. During COVID, I did extraordinarily poorly as possible, and I had opportunities to do other things, and I was like, no, you know what, I'm going to stick with this. I lost my job running the accounting and finance division for Lucas Group. Love those people to death. That they made the right move in doing what they did, and I came back into food service. And that's the other thing. I really enjoy people within food service sales and marketing. It's very relationship oriented, and 99.99% of them are nice, and the 1/10 of 1% that aren't is because I don't understand them.
Right. That's good philosophy. So I always say, what would be the one thing you would want our viewers to take away from your time today with us?
Good question. Maybe back to not making sure, if they think like I do. I've never done a podcast before. I've listened to hundreds and thousands of hours of it, but I've enjoyed this. And coming over here, I was like, I don't know, what in the world am I going to say? How in the world are we going to fill up 20 minutes? Well, you just the flat out learning. And in terms of the business piece of it, if you send me an email to, again, mware at foodservicerecruiting.com, you'll see at the bottom of it when I reply to you. If I've done my job well, you don't need to thank me. You're paying me. I appreciate your business. If I do it poorly, tell me. Not return my call. It's not like it happens often, but tell me what I've done wrong, and I'll either admit it and fix it, or I'll say I don't agree with you.
Wow, that right there, soliciting feedback is so critical to everything we do. And sometimes we don't want to get it because we're afraid of what somebody might say, but that's the only way we get better.
Yep.
And I appreciate you, Mike, coming to Overture and spending time with us. And we hope to have you back in the future. And thank you so much for your time.
You're very welcome. Thank you.